Visual composition is the organization of multiple parts into a harmonious whole. There's a variety of ways to achieve this. To look at unity and variety in an artwork. Unity is togetherness, cohesion, or oneness. Variety simply means difference. Looking for the right balance between unity and variety is a challenge for artists and will happen in every one of your pieces. Too much unity creates a sense of monotony. Too much variety creates chaos. Gestalt psychology emphasizes unity and connection. The German word Gestalt translates to whole in English, W-H-O-L-E. According to Gestalt theory, visual information is accepted holistically, meaning that we look at the whole artwork before we analyze its parts. An image created of elements that are too unrelated in content, size, orientation, or color will often seem unfinished or incomplete. To overcome this, the artist should create deliberate relationships with their visual elements. You see in this Adolf Gottlieb painting here, his painting of the circle at the top, and then you have these three parallel vertical lines that seem to point towards it. You also have a little piece of drip paint that points back down to that bottom. So we have this relationship between top and bottom, and this variety in shapes between the circle, the rectangle of the format, and then the rectangle of the added lines. Containment brings unity by creating relationships that seemingly occur naturally when visual elements are sharing a common container. Another Adolf Gottlieb painting. Here you can see that he's divided the painting loosely into a grid. You can see the outlines in gray forming these different rectangles. Then notice that each rectangle contains its own unique composition, if you will. A series of lines or shapes or colors. So the grid pattern alone helps create a sense of unity, but then look at how he handles some of these lines. The curvilinear lines that you see here is repeated here and here in a different kind of way. Then we have lines that seem to point, almost like an arrow. We have circles that are repeated. We have X's that are repeated across this format as well. So he's making these visual connections by taking shapes that are similar and again contained within the container of the format, and then the individual containers that you see as part of the grid. Indeed, the edges of your piece, the format, is its first and primary container, but most images inside that format have other shapes, many of which can serve as containers. You can see some basic shapes here in the Sam Francis painting. See the circle and the sort of oval shape at the bottom. And notice that all the light and color and energy is mostly contained within those two shapes. It's one way to provide unity between all these disparate kind of shapes, ones that look drawn and others that maybe he simply splattered paint. Proximity is the distance between visual elements. Sometimes shapes are placed close to one another. That's a way to help make them seem more unified. Placing shapes together sometimes creates energy. Distant shapes are seen more separately. You see the connection of shapes here in the André Cortege photograph of Mondrian's glasses. And you see the pairs of glasses and the bowl and the pipe there placed more or less together in the center of the frame. Their placement or location, their proximity near each other suggest a visual connection. Well, the glasses may connect in terms of content as well, but there's no real physical connection between a pipe and a pair of glasses, but in his title, he suggests they're from one person, they're part of that personality. So maybe the subject itself connects them, but it's really more the sense of line. You see here, that line parallels some of the other lines or connects with some of the other lines and shadow. I love in this composition too how he placed the edge of the table so that it seems to point right to the edge of the format. In doing so, notice that he's created two geometrical shapes, two triangles on the top of his image. This Edouard Manet painting, one of his more famous pieces, Le Déjeuner sous l'herbe. You can read the translation, Luncheon on the Grass from 1863. The proximity of the figures in the foreground suggests a connection between them. They seem to be sitting together, talking together, while the woman seems to recognize the painter's presence. They seem to be working together as a group, as a unit. Then we have this other woman in the background. Well, she's separated in terms of distance. Her proximity is a little further apart, as well as the change in scale that suggests that she's in the background. We don't know if she's part of this party or not. She may be, but she may be somebody entirely separate from the people with the luncheon in the foreground. It's the proximity of those shapes that helps suggest or create the narrative. Another aspect of proximity is fusion. Fusion occurs when shapes are placed so close together that they share a common edge. This M.C. Escher piece is a good example of that. And in some ways, filling his format with all of these rectangles and trapezoids and these other geometric shapes defined by edges and colors. He's created a pattern. It's hard to see where one shape ends and the other begins in some ways. Interestingly, this was some wallpaper that he designed. Continuity is created when fluid connections exist between compositional elements or detail. It's a way of achieving unity. This is a great example, this Frank Stella painting that you see here. And if you really look, it's kind of symmetrical, the same on both sides, although the colors and the shapes are slightly different. But notice how the lines and the shapes intertwine and overlap to some extent. It's a way of connecting the different elements and colors in this piece. Similarity uses similar lines, shapes, textures, values, or colors to increase unity. In Sandy Scoglin's photograph of her built installation, Revenge of the Goldfish, you can see that she used these ceramic goldfish, which she made and painted herself, and then placed in various parts of the room and hung them from the ceiling. When she makes these images, essentially what she does is she creates a room, she builds a room, brings in props, she painted the bed and the nightstand and the lamps and all those kinds of things. So you see that she's painted them a similar color, so she's connecting them partly from the similarity of color. Then she contrasts that background, the room, with these goldfish. Again, they're similar shapes and similar colors, and it provides that unifying presence of this dreamlike image. Well, using a visual system is another way to create unity in your pieces, by using an underlying pattern or a grid, for example. David Hockney's composite photograph here, the still life with blue guitar, which is made up of small Polaroid photographs, about 4 by 4 inches each square that you see there. And then he's photographed and then laid them out and pasted them together on a larger board. So it's creating this sort of cubist-like composition. And again, the cubism is showing three-dimensional objects on a two-dimensional plane where you're seeing them from multiple sides. Indeed, in Hockney's piece here, He's often using some of the same subject matter that the Cubist painters did as well. The musical instruments and the still life in the foreground that you see, the vegetables and even the flower pot there in the background. Often those are common subject matters in the Cubist works earlier in the century. In this Linda Connor photograph, it's a different kind of grid in essence, where you can see that she's photographed a photograph in a house, but we have this mysterious presence of light. Well, I think you can read that that's light coming in a window, so it's light shining through and then exposing the wall to that light, but also including the texture that's coming through the window. It's almost, in a way, overlaying a grid or a pattern on top of other information to connect the two. Well, using diptychs or triptychs, a diptych is using two images side by side to create essentially one larger scene, or a triptych in this case of Mike Mandel and Larry Sultan. This is from their book, How to Read Music in One Evening. What they did in this series is they took found imagery, usually from advertisements and things like that, and then copied those images and placed those appropriated images in close proximity to one another. So it seems to suggest a storyline, even if that storyline sometimes is elusive. We'll notice from left to right, we see circular shapes that run throughout. You see that here, you see it repeated here, and you see it here. And you also notice that what they're depicting in these advertisements, in these found advertisements, are essentially absurd little tools. Closure implies connections between visual fragments. The artists that use closure rely on the viewer to fill in the missing links, and generally our eye will do exactly that. George Seurat's pointillist painting here is an example of that. If you looked at this painting very closely, it's made up of small little dots or dabs of paint that he's added to the surface of his canvas. Seen from afar, it looks more blended. When you get close up, they're actually very abstract. But our mind fills in the gaps between those different brush marks, and we kind of read the scene, no problem.